Good afternoon, everyone, here in this room and at home. My name is Vita Lucarelli. I'm an associate of Egyptology at the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Culture, as well as a member of the for Middle Eastern Studies, which I wish to thank, and in particular its chair, who is present here, Professor Asad Ahmed, for sponsoring.
Oh God! I mean, I was just looking for trade first.
Why don't let's crash the networks, and then they either there or they're not, and then it gets us closer to Brooklyn. And yeah, it's weird. It's like a yeah. I mean, it's
Well, Tracy's gonna come down. She's already now. I don't know. I want to bring her down from Canal and just go to Westville.
The world of Black sci-fi.
Yeah, but Canal's the train is right there. I don't know. I might.
Fundamental work for whoever is interested in.
So you want to have a drink? You want to have a drink? We can have a drink though.
And culture.
All right, Westville for one.
He's also a prolific writer of novels like the time travel series, The Rayla Unit. Today, she will also present to us her latest upcoming work, a graphic novel entitled Blak Kube, and she has worked as a filmmaker and as director of the Afrofuturist dance film A Love Letter to the Ancestors from Chicago, which was played at the Afropunk Festival in Brooklyn. She has created and leads an Afrofuturist dance therapy program for teens and adults, and she's often providing workshops to high schools, corporations, and museums. Ytasha has also lectured at several universities. She created and moderated the University of Chicago's Afrofuturist Symposium in 2018 in partnership with the Oriental Institute, where there is also a Center of Study for Egyptology. And the event had a special focus on time travel and ancient Egyptian and Nubian arts influences in comics and Afrofuturism, and the participation with a number of Egyptologists as well. And having Ytasha here tonight also gives me a chance to announce a new project that I have initiated since 2020, and that focuses on the modern and contemporary reception of ancient Egypt in Black America. The cultural imagining of ancient Egypt and of its monuments, writing, and religion has been at the basis of the histories of Egyptology, and especially in the Western Egyptomania, which originated in Greece and Rome and continued to prosper in Europe and the West before and after Napoleon's campaign in Egypt in 1798-99. But the reception of ancient Egypt has influenced also many philosophical, political, religious, and cultural movements and trends in modern Egypt itself, what is called pharaonism, as well as in Africa, the Middle East, and in the African American communities in the US. This project aims at creating a channel and platform of communication and collaboration between Egyptologists and scholars of African and African American studies, which is still unfortunately missing. The very inspiring productions of artists and scholars from the African Afrocentrists and Afrofuturists in particular are generally ignored by the Egyptological community, which is still predominantly white. Only recently, the renewed interest towards Nubian studies and the study of the Nile Valley on a comparative perspective as an African society is helping to establish a more inclusive approach to the study of ancient Egypt and its rich material and written culture, and consequently it is helping to decolonize the field of Egyptology. I'm therefore happy today that we discuss the cross-cultural references between ancient Egypt and Afrofuturism in a lecture entitled Afrofuturism, Ancient Egyptian Inspirations, Evident both in Aesthetics and Practice. And I hope that this lecture will inspire a series of other similar events where scholars and authors of diverse background with a common love for ancient Egypt who get together and exchange ideas and perspectives about Kemet, the Black Land, as the Egyptians called the Nile Valley. Before giving the floor to Ytasha, and thank you, Ytasha, for being here, please remember for you at home, if you have any questions, to write them in the chat so that then we can read them to Ytasha. Thank you and enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
I'm so excited. I'm more than delighted to be sharing with you all today, and especially because we're talking about Afrofuturism and its ancient Egyptian inspiration. And in Black American cultures and Black diasporic cultures, ancient Egypt is so central to our ideas of utopia. And in many respects, it's, I would say it's central to the idea of a protopia. When people talk about this idea of pulling the best of the past and moving it into in a Pan-African context, it's usually centralized with the symbol of Sankofic. And Sankofic is a common symbol that comes out, that's referenced frequently. And when this particular symbol, it's really a celebration of thinking about futures and histories, but you're constantly interrogating these futures and histories. And for people in the diaspora, thinking upon ancient Egypt as a point of inspiration is really central to a lot of the creativity, but also central to the assertion of the contributions of people of African descent to the worlds of philosophy, to the worlds of antiquity. And in a way that resonates very strongly today. And it's interesting when I was asked to talk about this, and when I was listening to the talk that you did as well, it was almost difficult for me to not think of how ancient Egyptian histories or ideas around it have influenced contemporary African American diasporic cultures. I think some of my first images of the pyramids didn't necessarily come from watching the documentary. It didn't come from going to museums, although I did go to museums early in my life and my childhood. It came from looking at album covers that were laying around the house. And these album covers were, they were jazz artists, they were funk artists, Earth, Wind, and Fire in particular. And those images, which I'm showing you quick, they were ancient, and then simultaneously they were futuristic. There's a group, a jazz collective called the AACM, and their mantra is ancient to the future. And part of that mantra, that edict that has helped fuel the creativity and the experimental jazz that they're known for, is inspired by this idea of what ancient Egypt symbolized. So in Western culture, as we know, ancient Egypt is referenced as being the great society that influenced ancient Greece, influenced ancient Rome, and in a paradigm where whiteness is often or validated or is in part of this kind of hierarchical pyramid of existentialism in this particular culture over the past several centuries. Ancient Egypt continued to reign as this looming inspiration. So despite the fact that people of African descent were enslaved, despite the fact that people of African descent had been enslaved and brought to the New World, and histories erased, not taught, the story. Despite all this, ancient Egypt was still very prevalent in the West. So in the evolution of our Western society, ancient Egypt is a great influence, despite the fact that ancient Egypt is an African nation. So in that extent, when you think about African histories and how they've been taught, ancient Egypt, although it wasn't centralized, the people and the culture were of color, their impact was so great that it was still taught and revered in the Western world. And so there were people of African descent, as you start moving into the early 20th century, who went through this process of reclamation, of centralizing Egypt as being in Africa, but then also centralizing the fact that these were people of color, people who today could be described as Black in some cases, and celebrating that. But it's more than the reclamation of the history. One of the reasons that people of African descent or Afrofuturists find so much excitement in the ancient Egyptian world is in part because they're fascinated by the philosophies of it. So here we have a cover from the crisis. This is an issue, I believe, from 1921, and the crisis was a publication by evokes. And in this particular issue, you see the Uranus, you see that there's a celebration or an attempt to educate people on Egypt's Black orientation and Black roots, and doing so in a historical context, and trying to really assert that people of African descent had made great contributions to the ancient world in a way that wasn't celebrated. Sandra, who of course you know this, is a figure that is very fascinating in jazz, in part because he had this coming of age experience where he talks about recognizing that he was really from another planet. And his recognition that he was from another planet was so transformative that he realized that he was coming to this world to help people with music, to help people teleport with music. And the sense of alienness that he felt as a Black person was really very much justified because he said he was in fact an alien. But he was brought to this world, as he believed, to heal people through music that was not typical of the times. So although it came out of this jazz era, he very much stretched sound. And the idea was that to do so was very space age, but then it was connected to the sort of ancient Egyptian identity. And I find it sort of fascinating because it starts to go back to this mantra again that the AACM uses, where they're talking about ancient to the future, going back to this idea of Sankofic, where you're bring the best of the past, moving to the future, but also seeing, recognizing that Afrofuturism, or that these ideas of future are tied to these past. And so I find that really interesting that in one sense, he's saying, hey, I'm an alien to the planet, but simultaneously, he's referencing to a deity that's very much born of earth. And so this idea of mining on both sides of time is just this theme that you're always going to see in Afrofuturist works. And it's so ingrained in the culture that I think for people who do it, they almost have to stop to articulate that that's what's happening. When I talk to people about Afrofuturism, I tell them that it's a way of looking at the future or alternate realities, but through a Black culture. When I'm saying Black, I mean the intersection of people, whether they're in the Americas, or the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere. Thinking about where these philosophies of time and space intersect for people who are of African descent around the world. Afrofuturism intersects liberation, technology, mysticism, but simultaneously, it differs from a lot of my takes on the future because of how it views time. Not looking at time as linear, recognizing that it's very much non-linear. And when I think about a figure like Sandra, who's kind of really typify how we talk about Afrofuturism, his relationship to both time and space is non-linear. It's an idea that we see in African cosmologies, but it's also an idea that we see in ancient Egypt. And now I'm going to talk about ancient Egypt, African cosmology. I can emphasize that. It's very fascinating the symbols that people are pulling from in ancient Egypt as reminders of this, not the sense of timelessness, but also the sense of a large cosmic identity, which is also then connected to this idea of creating. Sometimes people talk about it today as being manifesting. How does one create their life? How is one a co-creator with the environment around them? A lot of the excitement around looking to ancient Egypt is about understanding these philosophies. Here you have these great societies that lasted for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. What did they do? What were they studying? How did they live? What were their values? What were their principles? And is there anything there that we can nurture and make applicable today to create a more protopian society, one that better reflects the ideals of humanity? What were their rituals? What were their celebrations? And how can we modernize that? But then also, what is it that they did that we're already doing? And how can we build it? And so to that end, I think there's two things happening with this celebration of culture, or the celebration of ancient Egypt. There's this reclaiming of Egypt as being a space of people of color, centralizing it in the African context. But there's also a desire to look at these beliefs as foundational for how one can live and think and be. But that sense of being is not one where it's about, oh, let's build pyramids because they built pyramids, or let's build an obelisk because they built it. It's really about developing a sense of self. How does one interrogate their own relationship to space and time and create an interdimensional relationship with themselves, with their society, and with the larger world? So looking to ancient Egypt as the basis for that is a step in building a new society. So it's very much about this internal transformation and connecting to the community, but it starts with an internal transformation. And I think that's interesting because it's not just cosmetic. It's not just about, oh, we put on like really thick liner and, let me dress like the Egyptians. It's this deeper relationship. And it's not one purely about lineage. Sometimes there's some controversy. People say, oh, the people who are African American today, they can be descendants of ancient Egyptians. And clearly everyone who's African American today is not necessarily a descendant of ancient Egyptians. Some could be. But the point, as I mentioned, isn't to establish direct lineage, but to really look at how people engage those ideas, how they may have shaped the spaces that many of us came from, but also how it plays a role or can play a role in this evolution. One that can almost be compared with a spiritual transformation. So again, thinking about Sun Ra, who's playing this alien identity, but also this deity, whose the relationships of this deity was established on Earth. I think it speaks to this larger viewing of ancient Egypt as transformative. And not purely in that to maybe, but thinking about it as sort of this larger transformation of who you can be and where you can go in society. Here's Sun Ra performing in Egypt in the actual album was called Egypt 1971 because they were performing in Egypt in 1971 with the orchestra. And the ideas that I'm discussing are also in line with the Osiris Set Society. Now, the Osiris Set Society was an organization created in the early 70s. And the founder, who also was a Juilliard trained musician, had the idea that ancient Egypt was almost like the mother society. And as it went into a space of decline, a lot of the best of Egypt, ancient Egypt, you can find in belief systems around the world. So this particular group pulled from Hinduism, it pulled from other African cosmologies, it pulled from a range of spiritual systems and cosmologies, and then did something that was somewhat recreationist. Started utilizing these other cosmologies to create practices where the actual ancient Egyptian deities were brought to life and became symbols of aspects of self, and became symbols that people could integrate into their life with beliefs and practices and so forth. And I find that because I think one could argue that many of our spiritual paths that we've adopted are recreationists in one sense, but this one specifically was looking at an array of spiritual systems and saying, hey, if we look at the different elements here, we can understand what the ancient Egyptians were really thinking, what some of their spiritual beliefs were, and let's see if we can incorporate that into our practice. And there's a lot of artists, perhaps because the founder himself was an artist, who in some ways loosely affiliated. And there are a number of books, here's one by Veronica, where they're recognizing that. And I think that when you look at the symbols that are probably most popular in, if you're looking at Black diasporic art, if you're looking at Afrofuturism, the principles of Womack are discussed frequently. The symbol itself is one that's very common. Here's another book that came out of the Sankofic Society. I remember seeing this book when I was in college. Many students have read it, but it's still by grappling with fear on it. And again, this is taking these different principles, taking different cosmologies, and trying to look at a broader sense of self. Phil Koran was a trumpet player in Sunrise Band. And he was in there, I believe, maybe for about 3 years or so. And then he created the AACM. And the AACM, as I mentioned, is the organization that has the mantra of ancient to the future. And there's a lot of experimentation in the music and experimentation in electronics. As a matter of fact, the organization just celebrated its 53rd anniversary. So it's a collective that began in Chicago. Sunrise coming of age experience was in Chicago. And I think it's interesting that Phil Koran came out of that group and then formed this musical collective that was really building on the same ideas that Sunrise was doing. We're probably doing so in a way where there was more engagement with the collective. He created one of the African American theater in the 60s that was very influential. And among his many proteges are the R&B funk singer Shaka Khan, and also Maurice White, who founded Earth Father. Here's an album that Phil Koran put together that recorded with the Afro Planetarium, and Phil Koran is probably most known for playing harp. And I've had the pleasure of seeing him perform on many occasions. But if you have an opportunity, I would suggest listening to this album. There's on YouTube. It's a rare album, very hard to find. And I think you'll enjoy, if you look, there's a song for Black Kube. But then he's also aligning this with the go and looking at the celebration of the Sahara Desert in general. What you're finding is looking at ancient Egypt as the source and then connecting it with these other African cosmologies. And so we mentioned that that's something that came out of the Sex Society, But we see that in the work that Sunrise is doing. We see that in the Quran, and it's kind of moving through the decades here. So Maurice White, who I mentioned, was a student of Philip Coran's on the Earth, Wind, and Fire. Voila. And here are the album covers I grew up seeing around the house. Very beautiful music, but the music is very utopian. If you have a chance to listen to Earth, Wind, and Fire, if you're not familiar with the group, it's this big band sound, you know, heavy brass. And often some of their songs are very popular with Black college kids. But the music is all about love and peace and harmony and humanity. They have songs about, you know, intimate love, but also this broader sort of cosmic relationship. They're named in part after the elements that the members of the group participate in. And I also have to note that Phil Coran, while he formed this experimental music collective, he also taught cosmology classes, astronomy classes, and astrology classes with a lot of reference to ancient Egyptian symbols. More of our fire covers. This one I think is pretty fascinating because it's going back to the idea of ancient to the future again, right? You see, you know, there's more, you have the tech element, you have the ancient element, and also a reference, I think, of femininity. So Afrofuturism is unique as a way of talking about futures, not just because it centralizes Black cultures, but also because it celebrates what we call the divine feminine. It celebrates the intuition and our relationship with nature in the same way that it recognizes our thinking natures. And in a lot of cosmologies, the feminine is the intuitive, it's the relationships with the feelings, the masculine is our thinking nature, but we're really talking about aspects of self, not people, not bodies, not identities, but aspects of self and how that's ultimately liberated. Charles Earling, a great jazz performer, I think one of my favorite songs by him was one called On the Leave This Planet, and it came out in 1971. But this is an album cover for the Great Pyramid. And the pyramid itself, in a lot of diasporic Afrofuturist works, has almost become like a symbol of transformation. I think about almost the grounding of it and the way it reaches a peak as being comparable to how some people talk about the chakra systems. You know, this idea of energy moving up through the body, out of the crown chakra. A lot of the headpieces, the adornments that we see with deities in ancient Egypt, and people who are sort of recreating themselves as deities as well, is this idea of a higher relationship, this cosmic identity, but it's one that's very rooted. And the pyramid, symbolically, has become a representation of that transformation. Lorraine Brady is an artist who, in 1980, had a performance that she called the Nefertiti, the Brunette of Antiquities. And among many things, Lorraine O'Grady is most known for taking two images side by side that are they aren't necessarily complements, they aren't necessarily opposites, but there's a relationship. And here, Lorraine O'Grady, who's a woman of raised in America, of Caribbean descent, she was thinking about her relationship with her older sister, being one that was similar to Nefertiti's relationship to her younger sister, one that was somewhat contested. And in thinking about this relationship, she wanted to put these figures together. And she's interrogating a couple of ideas. There's this very intense personal relationship that she had, but she also felt that her sister looked very much like Nefertiti. And so can't make a lot of arguments against that one. But if you go to the Brooklyn Museum, they have other images from the exhibit, including this one, where you see other pictures of her sister, along with images of Nefertiti. There are also pictures of Nefertiti's son, not pictures, but pictures of the statues of Nefertiti's son, along with her son. And it almost feels like there's this larger than life connection between these two figures, at the very least, biblical. And this, it becomes significant because this is a woman of African descent. And she's just sort of, she's also recognizing that culturally there's people who are very similar. So the Black Age in comics was a movement founded in the 90s by Ytasha L. Ytasha L. was very inspired by one of the comic scene in the 70s that was coming out of France and wanted to build more space for an independent comic book movement in the absence of people of African descent being able to participate in more traditional comics to the extent they wanted to. And he called that scene the Black Age in comics. He also created his own comics. And one of his first was this one, not particular pyramids. And so when he created this comic, it was not considered counterculture to, at least within the African American community, to have a superhero figure who's protecting the pyramids. It made all the sense in the world. And so he created this, and he's looking to do two things. He's looking to establish the Nubian relationship because he's saying that he's protected specifically Nubian pyramids. But he does something that's similar. He says that this character is on planet Nubia. Okay, so Nod isn't a protector of the ancient pyramids per se. He's a protector of these pyramids on planet Nubia. But again, going back to the idea of Sankofa, you're bringing the best of antiquity and you're moving it into the future. Or you're taking the best of something that's very grounded and then making it very of space. You're putting it in a dimension where it's very much cosmic. I think the illustrations here are really fascinating. He has a great style. And the style that he created is what he called rhythmism. And rhythmism was a term that really predated the term Afrofuturism. But when Ytasha created this term, he was thinking more of the visual arts, talking about these ideas of the relationship of space, technology, imagination, and liberation, but how that looks physically, how that looks artistically, and doing something comics. And to do something comics is significant because comics were considered the people's people. It was considered it wasn't high art. It wasn't the sort of art form you would see if you went to the galleries at the time. And so this idea of wanting to communicate these ideas of ancient Egypt or ancient India and engaging people in communities was done through the art and through symbolism. Now, if you think about a lot of the images that you've seen so far, you'll note that there are a lot of pyramids and a lot of arcs and a lot of winged figures. This I thought was just really cute as a postcard that's available at some comic shops in Chicago. That is a celebration of this comic novel, Protecting the Pyramids. Ytasha was also a part of a celebration of comic book creators out of the Chicago independent scene that was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago just last season. So the first time I ever saw the that I remember connecting with the symbol was listening to Erykah Badu. Erykah Badu, the soul singer, was singing about the she was singing about, she would mention quantum physics in her songs. She would talk about life and love, but there was also this broader identity or sense of spirituality that was coming through the music. But when she came out, when she debuted, studying with Baiduism, she was known for her headpiece, but also wearing the ankh. And really a popular jewelry accessory at the time, particularly in a lot of African American neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods. And it's not hard to go to a street vendor and get a ring with an ankh. And when I think about how it's a symbol of life, it says it's a symbol of everlasting life, it says the key of life. When I think about how ancient that is, the fact that people are born on today, there's something very wonderful about that, something very powerful and very present about the symbol and what it means for people. This is an image by John Jennings. He's a publisher of Metascope Comics. Metascope is releasing a number of Black novels. He created this image, and I wrote a story, short story to go along with this individual essay. But Afrofuturism, the story I want to talk about is like the space rhythm princess. The space rhythm princess, and again, these ideas of tying back sunrise, earth, wind, and fire, where she's very celestial, but real. There's this cosmic identity, and yet she's the embodied, the feminine, where she's in the ankh. The original song was by Michael Santamaria, a Cuban artist, and the lyrics are created by Oscar Brown, which was sung by Adam Lincoln, but also sung by Erica Badu. Raj G, one of my favorites, is an innovator on the music scene. He passed away several years ago, but he was a person who created a lot of experimental music digitally in what's now known as LED music, but pulling very much from some rock, particularly in the imagery here. The music is highly hip hop influenced. He has this tagline, he would say space bass. But this whole idea of taking the depth of the cosmos and feeling it very perfectly and using that as a source of inner revelation and inspiration. Again, we see the ankh. Lion Man is an image and a figure who actually comes out of the comics from the 40s. It's created by an African American artist, and John Jennings is rebirth in Lion Man. But this is pulling from Avatar, again, from an ancient Egyptian deity. And refresh the rebirth. The same here, this is an Egyptian Sphinx god. And now, these are recreations. They weren't created in the world of 1993, as it says here. If you look at the one, you see the symbol that says ANC. It typifies, I think at the time it was Negro comics, but it also, if you just try to pronounce it, it says ankh. And it's built into an ankh. So the pervasiveness of the symbol is fascinating. The Black Panther, as many of you know, played by the late Chadwick Boseman, was a figure who was originally in comics in 1966. And 1966, you think about some of the images we saw before, a lot of those are coming out in the 60s, movies, and 70s. This figure, Black Panther, eventually in some of his generations was created to be a symbol of the panther god Bast, who comes out of ancient Egypt. And that it's fascinating to me that in the creation of the Wakanda, which is the sort of super secret utopian, somewhat utopian world, or at least idealized, highly technological area that was not colonized in the Marvel comics, that we now are sort of thinking about with respect to futures. I think it's interesting that the primary deity that everyone is, that they're celebrating, that the Black Panther gets its power from, is an ancient Egyptian. And to me, that's very symbolic of ancient Egypt being viewed as central and having a lot of influence in this sort of two-way conversation that was taking place across the continent, and certainly the celebration of what ancient Egypt means for people today. So the character wasn't created with a relationship to vast and mystic, but in later iterations that became a prominent element of where the power came from. Here you see the panther god, very much a reverence for that space. And even if you guys follow the comic, the Black Panther was black. And there's Wakanda in space. But even as they move across the cosmos, into other solar systems, into other galaxies, they are bringing the Panther god, the stat energy. Envelope Clan is a comic that's illustrated by Stephen Harris. And he described it to me as a metaphysical martial arts action adventure. So it's pulling from figures from across the world, but you'll notice several Egyptian symbols here. You see the falcon associated with the forest, you see the hawk. The story was created by Ytasha L, and Horatio, who's one of the primary characters, is Brazilian, is a capoeira artist that derives his power from chords. Here they are with the battle in the pyramids. It's always fun. And again, we see the falcon imagery at the top of Forest, excuse me, at the top of a main character's head, embodying the power of Horus. Sons of Kemet, a great band out of the UK, also utilizes the image of the pyramid. Clearly, they're calling themselves Sons of Kemet. And there's, again, this desire to invoke this, the physical space of Egypt, ancient Egypt, through music. And that's constantly being rebirthed through similar imagery. This is an image from Tim Phillips' graphic novel called Night. His character begins as a chief in ancient times in a fictional African society. He's cursed to live forever among his many lives. He eventually winds up in a space-based society. But the image of the pyramid and sort of this Pan-African colors flag that's on it is this constant reminder of the desire to take the best of ancient Egypt and the lessons from that society and apply it in the future in the world. So Blak Kube is a book that I'm writing. Well, actually, I wrote, but we're currently on this graphic novel. And I take two figures from the Agua and look to them to be they're caretakers of a interdimensional art form, and engage with all of these artists across time in the African diaspora. I think it's rather fascinating that I wrote this book. And now today I'm talking about the subject matter because the through line is really symbolic of how ancient Egypt is always sort of rebirthing itself, always engaging with new creators, where the people have a conscious relationship with these ancient ideas of time. So The Antiquities are symbolized as two pairs, male and female. One symbolized by a snake, one symbolized by a toad. And the ones that I'm looking at are the two who celebrate darkness. Really kind of the darkness of the cosmos, the beginning before the beginning, the void that was creation, and using that as a metaphor to think about creativity and transformative powers that creativity can have in one's life. These illustrations are by Tim Tucker, who actually came of age here in the Oakland area. Santa is an artist I've done work with, but her life is so informed by ancient Egyptian stylings and beliefs that this is the way she represents herself on a daily basis. She was an actress in my short film, A Love Letter to the Ancestors from Chicago, and it's a film that looks at dance as interdimensional. But in the piece itself, I have two characters come together, they're in love. One is from Andromeda, one is from Kenneth. They are brought together and again, into the future. So these themes have been with us for at least a century or so, in African diasporic ideas. And I just find it rather fascinating that ancient Egypt has been such an inspiration for people. That there's a deeper connection to what that means. I talked to one friend of mine, his name is Kahari Lee. He's someone who was always reading about ancient Egypt, and I asked him why. And he said that ancient Egypt for him was like our Star Wars. You know, you have these empires and they were galactic and sensibility, and they really sort of looking to that as a space of inspiration, but constantly questioning what is it they did that made their society so great, and what can we do with that information today? I reached out to another friend of mine who actually studied with the Asara Society. He's a musician, and his name is Sean Wallace. And I asked him, what did ancient Egypt mean to him? What did he study? What did these ideas mean for him? And he said that he felt like ancient Egypt was the bridge. It's the bridge to understanding the ancient world. And the more you understand about ancient Egypt, it almost becomes this wormhole of experiences, questions, where you start to understand that the evolution of human beings is not as linear as we think, and that there are so many technologies. And I'm saying technologies, I don't just mean, gadgets and spaceships, but just ways of thinking that can benefit us today, all of which I find fascinating. So again, when I talk about Afrofuturism, I say that it's an intersection of imagination, technology, mysticism, liberation, and Black culture. But when you think about how ancient Egypt has been utilized by creatives, you'll see that it's very much centered in how we talk about Afrofuturism. Because ancient Egypt, I think for many people, is an intersection of the imagination, liberation, technology, and mysticism. And the deeper one has a relationship to that, the more people feel, some people who really contemplate these ideas, so that they can be transformed and make a greater contribution to our world. So that is what I have to share with you. If you have any questions or any thoughts, anything I'd like to share, I have see your questions here on my phone, ideally. Yes. And so if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
you have it there, right?
Oh, you,
No, I think Ytasha is getting, oh, here's the first one. Ytasha, if you go all the way at the bottom, I mean, apparently there were some issues with acoustic along the way.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the very end, Ytasha, you're going to begin to see the questions.
Okay.
So
Sure.
if you scroll all
If
the
there's
way.
any questions here in the audience, let me know too. I see a question. Besides spaces the place, Black Panther and Railroad to Ancestors from Chicago, do you know other Afrofuturist motion pictures with ancient Egyptian elements or themes? Would you consider the Black exploitation film Cleopatra Jones as related to Afrofuturism? I wouldn't necessarily think about Cleopatra Jones as Afrofuturist. I think she's very contemporary for the time. I will say that her name is clearly influenced by one of the more fascinating figures in Egyptian history, certainly never seen reviewed in the Western world, Cleopatra. And with respect to other films and projects, I think we're going to start to see more. I think that there are a lot of sort of short films, spaces in the indie world, where there's a lot of people who are able to really explore these relationships to Egypt and to ancient Egypt, maybe a little more so than, well, Black Panther was probably the first major film that people saw globally that really spoke to Afrofuturism. So I think you'll start to see more. The interesting thing though about, I think, how ancient Egypt's been utilized in a lot of the culture, this kind of African diasporic spaces, is that it's so ubiquitous that people are often looking, really digging to see how they could integrate or do a lot of comparison with other cultures out of the African world. It almost as if going to Egypt has become a default because it's been such a big part of the creative influence, at least for the past century or so. So I think what you'll start to see is certainly more in major things. And let's see. Was Earth, Wind, and Fire involved? I don't understand this one about the pharaohs. If you want to ask this question again, just let me know. But if you have other questions, please text them. And does anyone have any questions or thoughts about some of the things that you saw? I'd be curious to know what surprised you.
I mean, this is something that surprised me, but just a question. Do you have any examples of really close collaboration between people in kind of Western academia who study Egyptology as a discipline of study? Is that what the first part is, or is that a hope for the future?
Well, I can say that I put together a conference a couple of years ago where I started to do that. And I know that that's work that's taking place here as well. So I think at moments, right? Like I showed you the Afroplanetarian, which isn't necessarily Egyptology, but the work that they did with Phil Command and his group at the time. I think that there are probably moments that I would almost have to dig to document